Federal leaders for the Conservatives, Liberals, and NDP were all discussing building more homes and making homes more affordable during their campaign stops on Tuesday. Liberal leader Mark Carney told a campaign stop in the Vancouver area that a Liberal government would double the pace of housing construction using prefabricated and modular construction made with Canadian lumber. He called his party's plan, quote, the most ambitious housing plan since the Second World War.
Well, the U.S. is trying to keep high-quality, sustainable Canadian lumber out. We will use more of it here in our plan to double the pace of housing construction in this country over the course of the next 10 years. This is the most ambitious housing plan since the Second World War. We will build our way out of the housing crisis. We will build our way out of the economic crisis. We will make housing more affordable in Canada once more.
NDP leader Jagmeet Singh was also in the Lower Mainland, announcing a plan to clamp down on foreign, corporate, and speculative home buyers.
We're going to make it permanent, the ban on big money investors buying up Canadian homes. That should be a ban. Homes in Canada should be for you and your family, not for rich investors to get richer. In addition, we're going to end the loophole that allows speculators to flip homes year after year. That's got to stop. It just drives up the cost of homes and it makes it more expensive and impossible for everyday folks to buy a home. The thing is, we're in it for you. So we're going to put forward ideas that make it easier for you and your family to buy a home. We're not interested in billionaires making lots of money off of housing. We're not interested in investors and speculators driving up the cost of homes. We want to put a stop to that so that you and your family can actually afford a home.
And at a campaign stop in Edmonton, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre promised to enlist a task force to crack down on companies that stash money in offshore tax havens.
Right now, Canadians pay more for government in higher taxes. They pay more in taxes than they do for food, clothing, and shelter combined. In fact, the average family is paying $10,000 more tax today than they were before the lost Liberal decade. One, we will be naming a Bring It Home Economic and Tax Task Force, whose mandate will be to ensure that we close overseas tax havens and force the very wealthy to pay what they owe. My task force will specifically propose solutions to close loopholes that allow tax havens to be a source of evading taxes for the well-connected and the global elite. I'll also direct CRA to reapportion the use of its staff. We're going to have fewer auditors going after charities and small businesses and more going after international tax evaders. The goal will be to collect an extra $1 billion from international tax havens and by closing the loopholes that enable them.
And with housing being a main topic of discussion, I sat down with our news director, David Clement, to discuss the housing policies discussed and what the Liberals and Conservatives are bringing to the table. Now, both parties have made housing announcements on cutting the GST on homes and for first-time homebuyers. Walk us through just how big of a problem housing in Canada really is.
Yeah, so Canada has been plagued by a chronic undersupply of housing. So the numbers, if we go back to 2016, Canada had about 427 housing units per 1,000 people. In 2020, that number decreased to 426, and in 2022, it decreased to 424 units per 1,000 people. And so the available housing units per person has actually declined over time, and there have been some efforts made to try and ramp that up. We haven't seen that really bear fruit yet. But to put that into comparison to kind of peer countries, Canada has the lowest housing supply per capita in the G7. And so an example would be France. They have 540 units per 1,000 people. So really it comes down to that chronic undersupply, which is driving the cost of homes up. Simple supply and demand, you have increasing demand, limited supply, people bid higher on prices, and you see that kind of floor price increase over time.
And what are some of the key aspects holding Canada back when it comes to housing affordability?
Well, one of them is taxes and fees, and that is both federal, provincial, and local. So depending on the city, the total value of a new home, like the total end price of a new home, can be upwards of 30 to 40% new taxes and fees. So to the city, to the province, to the federal government through GST. And so when 40% of a home is fees and taxes, that leaves a lot of people wondering, why have we created a scenario where the largest cost in the development of a house is government? And so you have both the Liberals and the Conservatives putting forward policies to try and tackle some of the tax aspect that they can at the federal level. Another major issue, which is at the local level, is exclusionary zoning. And so these are rules that essentially limit what you can build on a piece of property. So in a city like Toronto, let's say 60 to 70% of the city is exclusionary zoned, which means you can only have one housing unit on a piece of property. So that means you can't build a fourplex or duplex or a triplex or any type of higher density homes, and that artificially restricts the total number of homes that can be available, because if you can't build more homes on the land within a city, then you have urban sprawl. That's why you see a lot of growth. If we look at Toronto again as an example, outside of Toronto proper, going as far as Milton, Kitchener, etc., is because people are being pushed further and further out of the cities.
And what are housing critics saying about these proposals?
I think the reaction from housing critics has been mostly positive in terms of this tackling the issue of taxation, but there still is the big question of zoning. And that's a local rule. But there have been some conversations about using the federal government either as a carrot or a stick to move cities along in terms of getting rid of exclusionary zoning. So that could be rewarding extra funding to cities to fund infrastructure projects when they get rid of exclusionary zoning, or withdrawing it and saying, if you don't meet this target, then we're not going to give you the money to build more roads and bridges and things like that. And so I would say it's probably mixed right now. Realistically, from the housing critic point of view, it's what are we doing to rapidly increase supply? And the calculation there isn't just taxes, it's a big part, but there's a lot more to that story. And so it's a bit of a mixed bag.
Now, the housing plans that each party has put forward, is it taking into consideration growing immigration, or is this just to deal with the current housing problem and then in 8 or however many years, we're going to go back to the drawing board and do this all again?
Yeah, and that's one of the areas where we won't really know until the campaigns put out if they do, put out their kind of projections on what they think immigration should be. Both the Liberals and the Conservatives have, I guess, hinted or talked about policies to scale things like temporary foreign workers and student visas back. Prime Minister Carney is in favor of the cap that the Trudeau government brought in. Pierre Poilievre has largely been in the same camp, talking about tying housing to immigration, so trying to accommodate for that. But it's very difficult to figure out the specifics of that calculation without having any type of immigration forecast saying we're only going to have X amount of people come in a year, add in whatever the natural birth rate is for everyone who's already here, and this is how many housing units we'll approximately need. This is my plan to get there. So we're still missing that important piece of the equation.
Now, a few critics have said recently that Pierre Poilievre made his housing announcement a few years back, and now Mark Carney's made his. And they're kind of saying that these seem like mirror promises. What do you make of those claims that they're extremely similar?
They are. They are very similar, almost identical. I mean, it's an interesting position for the Poilievre team, because whether it be the carbon tax or reversing the capital gains tax or housing policy, it's one of many now where Prime Minister Carney has essentially moved the Liberal Party to the center or towards the Conservatives. So yes, very similar. And I think that's probably largely part of the political climate that we're in, but also the fact that it would appear as of right now that Mark Carney is moving the Liberals to the center. And part of that has been adopting some of what were traditionally conservative positions on housing, on the immigration cap, on the consumer carbon tax. And so, yeah, they are almost identical.